The transmission arrived without warning, its eerie simplicity more disturbing than any hostile declaration could have been. The Galactic Senate had been convened for routine business, a rare moment of calm amidst centuries of political maneuvering, when the message flashed across every screen. At first, no one reacted. It was an unclassified routine update. But the moment the Senate's communication officer played the video, a chill ran through the chamber. The image was grainy, taken from a distant surveillance station. There was no explosion, no shockwave. In fact, there was nothing overtly threatening about it. The footage showed the arrival of a Terran ship, a sleek, unassuming vessel the size of a large cargo freighter. But the most unnerving part, the ship didn't make a single move after entering the sector. It simply sat there, hovering silently in deep space. Nothing about the ship screamed danger. It wasn't a warship. It wasn't heavily armed. And yet, as the transmission cut to the reactions of several local planetary governors, something in their faces was unmistakable. Fear, raw, unadulterated fear. A silence descended over the Senate. Ambassador Rojar of the Plerith Commonwealth leaned forward, his 6 eyes narrowing. What is this? What are they trying to say? Why don't they engage? The answer came not in words, but in the hollow echo of the Senate hall as an older Tarn envoy stepped forward. The envoy had been an advocate for peaceful relations between species for decades, known for his calm demeanor and well-respected status. He had never before shown emotion in public, yet now his voice wavered. "They're waiting for us," he said, his voice thick with tension. "That's what it is. They know we're watching them. And they don't care." The screen flickered again, switching to an intercepted transmission from the Terran ship, its message simple and to the point. "We are here. Do not approach. The path is ours." It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't a threat. It was simply a fact. The Senate buzzed with confusion. What did this mean? The Xarn envoy continued, his hand shaking slightly as he spoke. "This is no ordinary message. The Terrans are not trying to establish dominance. They are not issuing a warning. They are sending a signal of control. They are quietly claiming their place." A murmur rippled through the chamber. The Harkori, normally a stoic race, exchanged uneasy glances. The Coalition, known for their cold pragmatism, were tight-lipped. Even the arrogant Mzorki, who had previously dismissed Terran efforts as nothing more than youthful brashness, now looked uneasy. The Terrans had no fleet, no armadas waiting in the wings. There was no force backing their move. But that was what made it terrifying. As the minutes passed, the silence in the Senate grew unbearable. No one moved. No one spoke. The transmission lingered on the screen like a ghost, a subtle reminder of how fragile their dominion was in the face of a species they had barely acknowledged. The terrifying thought was shared by every being in the room, though none spoke it aloud. What if the Terrans didn't want to be part of the Senate? What if they were just waiting for everyone else to realize they had already won? The chamber door slid open, and a new delegate entered, a Terran ambassador, clad in dark, formal attire. She stood tall, her presence overwhelming, as all eyes turned toward her. The Terran didn't speak immediately, only letting the quiet stretch long enough to make it unbearable. And then, with a calm smile that made even the most seasoned senators feel uneasy, she finally spoke. "We've arrived," she said softly, her voice steady, "and we'll leave when we're ready. The question is, will you be ready when we do?" The Senate's collective breath caught. The Terrans had arrived, and they weren't asking for permission. The Senate had been stunned into silence by the Terran ambassador's quiet confidence, but as the chamber's tension slowly began to dissipate, the debate turned inward. To understand why this upstart species had caused such an uproar, one had to look back to the early days of Earth, before the stars were even a glimmer in humanity's eyes. Earth had once been a fractured, violent world, a place of constant wars and ravaged landscapes. No other species in the galaxy had witnessed such a violent history unfold over the span of mere centuries. There was nothing particularly special about Earth's environment. A temperate planet with seas and continents, a world capable of sustaining life. Yet it had taken humanity a mere few thousand years to nearly destroy itself. The relentless cycle of warfare, resource depletion, and nuclear fallout had driven humanity to the brink of extinction, and they came far too close to becoming another cautionary tale, a species that had burned too brightly, too soon. But then, something remarkable happened. Humanity survived. Unlike the countless others who had fallen victim to their own hubris, humanity learned. Slowly at first, then in bursts of desperate innovation. The wars stopped, not out of peace, but out of necessity. With each conflict, humanity had improved its capacity for destruction, but also its capacity for collaboration. And just when it seemed they would tear each other apart, they realized that the only way forward was to unite. The scars of war still lingered on Earth's surface, vast, lifeless zones where entire civilizations had fallen. But they also gave rise to something unexpected: resilience. It was this resilience that allowed humanity to develop one of the most extraordinary feats the galaxy had ever witnessed: unity. The Earth Directorate, formed from the ashes of war, became a beacon for human potential. Their collective resolve, born from the shadows of destruction, became their greatest strength. What made humanity truly terrifying, however, wasn't just their unity or innovation. It was their unyielding belief that they would never again fall victim to their own shortcomings. They had learned the harshest lesson of all. Survival meant adapting, and adapting meant never relying on the past. The result was an unprecedented era of technological growth and social cooperation. By the time the Federation first sent an envoy to Earth, humanity had already overcome many of the challenges they faced. They had created vast orbital cities, harnessed the power of their stars, and begun to spread across their solar system. They had rebuilt their economies, reorganized their social structures, and eliminated the need for constant warfare. They had taken the tools of their destruction and turned them into tools of construction. And when the first alien diplomats arrived, they were stunned by the humanity that greeted them. Where other species might have feared the Federation's intervention, humanity welcomed it with measured optimism. But there was one thing they quickly learned. The Terrans, the people of Earth, were not content to simply be members of the galactic community. They wanted more, and they were willing to fight for it. The Federation's envoys had attempted to strike deals with humanity, offering them access to technology and resources. But the Terrans had shown no interest in the trade agreements, instead focusing on one thing: survival. They wanted a seat at the table, but not to be subjugated by the old ways. They wanted to thrive, and if that meant challenging centuries of galactic hierarchy, so be it. The Federation had dismissed humanity's early warnings as the rash claims of a primitive species. They believed that humanity's unification was a temporary fluke, an anomaly in the chaotic timeline of galactic history. But now, the Senate could no longer ignore the undeniable fact. The Terrans had not just survived. They had evolved beyond the others, and they were coming for their place among the stars. As the debate within the Senate chamber turned frantic, several high-ranking ambassadors from more peaceful species quietly exchanged concerned glances. They understood one thing with perfect clarity. If the Terrans had learned one lesson better than anyone, it was how to endure. The galaxy had underestimated them. But as the Terran ships approached their borders, the Senate realized they could no longer afford to underestimate humanity's resolve. The Terrans were not just arriving to join the Senate. They were arriving to take it over. Convened in an emergency session, deliberating for hours over how to engage with this mysterious rising power. Some argued for diplomacy, others for caution, and a few, particularly the war-hungry Gorn, urged immediate military intervention. After all, no species could rise so quickly without some form of threat. In the end, the Senate chose a middle path. A delegation of diplomats, backed by a small fleet of warships, would travel to the Terran frontier to establish contact. The Terrans had made their intentions known, but until now, the galaxy knew little of their true capabilities. It was time to learn who they really were, and, if necessary, demonstrate the strength of the galactic powers. The fleet set off from the capital planet, its ships sleek and formidable, a symbol of the Senate's collective strength. The journey was long, stretching across light years, and the tension aboard the vessels was palpable. The representatives, composed of diplomats from various species, had their assignments: make contact, negotiate, and most importantly, assess the Terrans. The fleet's commander, Admiral Hanar of the Vrak Coalition, was known for his calm demeanor and shrewd tactics. Yet even he could not shake the uneasy feeling in the pit of his stomach as they neared the Terran border. When they arrived in the sector, there was no grand greeting, no dramatic display of force. Nothing. The Terran ships didn't immediately respond to their signals, and after several failed attempts, the fleet sent a squadron of small crafts to make first contact. It was an unassuming mission, the type of operation every fleet had carried out thousands of times across the galaxy. The squadron dropped out of hyperspace, their engines humming as they coasted toward the Terran border. But as the Terran ships came into view, something strange occurred. The Terran fleet didn't move. Instead, the ships appeared frozen in space, their sleek, angular shapes reflecting the cold stars around them. The small Terran crafts, the ones that the Senate diplomats had been so eager to engage with, floated in perfect formation. No weapons trained on the Senate ships, no aggressive maneuvers. They simply waited. The silence in the void of space was deafening. For a long moment, no one knew what to do. The Senate ships sent more signals, and when they received no response, the delegation made its way toward the closest Terran ship. As the diplomat team prepared to land, they noticed the unnatural stillness around them. There were no active scans, no detectable movement. The Terrans weren't even attempting to communicate. The only thing that reached them was the soft hum of their engines, which was somehow more unsettling than silence itself. And then, just as the lead diplomat, Ambassador Rorak of the Coalition League, stepped forward to deliver an opening statement, a message came through. It was broadcast in every known language, perfectly translated. "We are here. Do not approach. The path is ours." The transmission was as clear as it was chilling. It wasn't a warning, nor an invitation. It wasn't even an ultimatum. It was simply fact, a statement of purpose, a fact that shook the foundations of everything the Senate thought it understood about diplomacy, war, and power. Ambassador Rorak's eyes widened, and a murmur swept through the delegation. There were no demands, no requests, no urgency, no anger, just a chilling certainty. The Terrans weren't speaking to the Senate as equals. They were speaking to them as though they had already won. Admiral Hanar was the first to respond, ordering the fleet to hold its position. His tactical mind was working overtime, calculating, reassessing, trying to find a way to interpret this strange behavior. But the Terrans gave nothing away. No defensive maneuvers, no show of force, only a soft, unyielding stillness. The moment hung in the air, suspended in the vacuum of space, until another transmission came through. This time, the voice on the other end was calm, almost conversational. It was human, unmistakably so, and carried with it a subtle menace. "We are not interested in war. Not with you. Not with anyone. But you must understand this. If we wanted to take everything you hold dear, we wouldn't need to lift a finger. We would only need to wait." The message was brief, but its impact was immediate. The fleet waited in eerie silence as the Terran ships did nothing but observe. In that moment, the Senate realized they were not dealing with an ambitious species seeking to conquer. They were facing something far worse. A species that didn't need to conquer because it already held all the cards. Ambassador Rorak turned to Admiral Hanar, his voice barely audible. "What do we do now?" The Admiral paused, his gaze fixed on the unmoving ships before them. "We wait," he said. But not for long. For the first time in a long while, the Senate realized the Terrans weren't just arriving. They were already here, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The uneasy silence that had followed the first contact with the Terrans was shattered just days later, when a chilling report came through the Senate's communication channels. The Gorn military, eager to prove their strength and cast off the perceived threat of the Terrans, had acted with reckless ambition. Despite the warnings, they had launched an unprovoked attack on one of the frontier colonies, a small, resource-rich planet just beyond the Terran border, home to a handful of species, and a convenient target for the Gorn to show their might. The Senate had ordered caution, but the Gorn were always quick to act when they smelled opportunity. The attack on the colony was brutal, but swift, with the Gorn warships decimating any resistance. Yet, in their zealous pursuit of dominance, they made one fatal miscalculation. The colony was Terran-controlled, and the Terrans weren't interested in letting such an affront go unanswered. When the Gorn fleet arrived in orbit, they expected a battle. They had planned for it. What they didn't expect was the sudden appearance of a lone Terran warship, a sleek, unarmed vessel, appearing without warning on the outer edge of the system. The Gorn admiral, confident in his superiority, ordered an immediate strike, launching a barrage of plasma missiles aimed directly at the Terran ship. The missiles never reached their target. Before the Gorn could even react, a pulse of blinding light enveloped the entire fleet. It wasn't a conventional weapon. There was no explosion, no collision. It was as if the very fabric of space had been bent, and the Gorn fleet's weapon systems, their communications, their shields, their engines, all simply shut down in an instant. The ships drifted, helpless and lifeless, unable to function. The Terran vessel, undisturbed, drifted forward and made its way toward the Gorn fleet. A single transmission was sent out, calm and composed. This was a warning. Your aggression will be your undoing. The message wasn't a threat, not really. It was a fact. There would be no battle, no further destruction. The Gorn fleet was left in a stunned paralysis. And then, as quickly as they had arrived, the Terran ship turned and left. Not a word more. There were no fires, no debris. The fleet was alive, but it was utterly powerless. The Terrans hadn't destroyed them. They had simply rendered them irrelevant. Within hours, the Gorn fleet signaled surrender, requesting permission to land on the planet to salvage what they could. But when they arrived, they found only a desolate landscape. The colony was reduced to ash. The Terrans had evacuated the civilians and left the planet in ruins. The destruction wasn't the result of a battle. It was deliberate, a statement of intent. The Gorn were left in shock. The message was clear. The Terrans could not be provoked, but they would not hesitate to erase anything standing in their way. A report was quickly sent to the Senate, detailing the destruction, and an emergency session was called. The delegation from the Gorn was in disarray, their pride shattered. They were no longer the dominant force on the frontier. The Terrans had made that abundantly clear. Ambassador Rorak of the Coalition League stood before the Senate, his voice grave. The Terrans, they are not like us. They do not seek conquest, but they will not hesitate to erase anything that threatens them or the order they intend to create. The Gorn made a grave mistake in thinking they could bully them. The Senate chamber erupted into frantic discussion, with some urging immediate retaliation, while others saw the destruction of the colony as a warning that humanity was no longer playing by the same rules. This wasn't just about technology or weapons anymore. It was about something far more insidious: the Terrans' absolute control over their destiny, and the chilling confidence with which they wielded it. In the wake of the Gorn disaster, an unsettling realization began to spread among the Senate members. The Terrans weren't just surviving in the galaxy. They were reshaping it. And every power, every faction that had long ruled the stars, now had to consider the possibility that the Terrans had no interest in being a part of their games. The galaxy had just learned its first painful lesson. The Terrans did not need to fight to win. They only needed to wait and the universe would bend to them. In the weeks following the Gorn disaster, the Senate found itself divided. While some species clamored for immediate retaliation, others argued that the Terrans' actions, though ruthless, were strategically brilliant. The Terrans had shown that they didn't need to fight. They didn't need to destroy to achieve their goals. They were terrifyingly efficient in their power. The diplomatic channels buzzed with frantic discussions. In private, however, more than one high-ranking member of the Senate began to question something far deeper. What if the Terrans were right? What if the galaxy had been playing a game of endless politics and posturing for millennia, while the Terrans had been quietly preparing for something far more dangerous? A new order, one where survival and patience were the only true measures of power. Ambassador Rorak of the Coalition League, once a staunch advocate for negotiation and peaceful coexistence, found himself in deep contemplation. He had always believed that time was a luxury in galactic politics, but the Terrans had shown that time itself could be weaponized. They had waited, bided their time, and when they finally acted, they did so with an absolute efficiency that made traditional strategies look primitive by comparison. As more reports came in from the frontier, it became clear that the Terrans weren't just a threat to be countered. They were a new force entirely. Their fleet, though small, had been gathering resources at an astonishing rate. The ships that had once been seen as primitive were now recognized for their incredible resilience and adaptability. Terran technologies, once dismissed as crude or experimental, were revealed to be more advanced than anyone could have predicted. And it wasn't just their ships or weapons, it was their ability to think beyond the limitations of conventional warfare. In the halls of the Senate, the whispers began. What are the Terrans preparing for? What do they want? The truth was that no one really knew. The Terrans had said little about their intentions. They had made their first move by decimating the Gorn colony, but after that, they retreated into silence. And yet there was a subtle pressure building, a sense that the galaxy was being watched and that every step was being calculated. Then came the unsettling reports from a nearby system. A previously uninhabited sector of space, once considered of little value by most galactic powers, had suddenly become the site of an unprecedented Terran construction effort. Satellite networks and deep space drones began to capture images of massive installations being built in the void, structures that seemed to defy conventional understanding. The scope of the operations was immense. Entire asteroids were being hollowed out, transformed into huge space stations and shipyards, and all the while, no one had seen a single Terran warship, no direct confrontation, only a quiet, relentless buildup. On the surface, the Senate was still pretending to play by the old rules, with diplomatic delegations and military posturing, trying to maintain the facade of stability. But behind closed doors, the leaders of the galaxy's most powerful factions were beginning to panic. They had spent centuries negotiating, fighting, and reshaping the balance of power. And now, a species that had been considered beneath them, a species they thought they understood, was silently and efficiently turning the tables. The Terrans weren't looking for dominance. They were looking for control. They were building something that was not just a fleet, but an infrastructure, a galaxy-wide system of influence. No one knew how or why, but it became clear that the Terrans weren't trying to conquer the galaxy in the traditional sense. They were going to reshape it in their image, and they were willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. And what was the most terrifying part of all? The galaxy's leaders didn't know if they were ready for a war with the Terrans, or if they were simply going to wake up one day and find that the Terrans had already won. Days passed, and the Senate, once proud of its collective power, was now in a state of quiet disarray. There were no grand speeches, no declarations of war. The factions that had once ruled the galaxy now found themselves unsure of their next move. And in the silence, a single truth became clear. The Terrans were no longer just a force to be reckoned with. They were becoming the galaxy's new reality. Months passed in a haze of uncertainty. The galaxy's powers continued their deliberations, trying desperately to find a strategy that could face the growing Terran influence without provoking an all-out conflict. The Senate had become a theater of old politics, where the speeches were grand but the actions were sparse. Meanwhile, the Terrans, in their quiet and calculated manner, continued to build. And what they were building wasn't just infrastructure, it was an empire. Not one of armies and warships, but one of influence and control. The Terran construction efforts reached new heights as entire sectors of space were transformed into vast orbital complexes. These installations, built in absolute silence, were often located near resource-rich planets or strategic locations, but their purpose remained unclear. Some suspected that the Terrans were simply preparing for some kind of military confrontation, but there was no evidence of weapon systems, no sign of warships being constructed. Instead, what appeared was an intricate web of communication relays, massive factories, and state-of-the-art medical facilities, all self-contained, all designed to sustain an ever-growing population. Then came the shocking revelation. The first exploratory mission from the Senate, a small fleet tasked with gathering more information on the Terran operations, reported back with footage that no one expected. The images were not of deadly weapons, nor were they of a secret military base. Instead, they revealed something far more disconcerting. The Terrans were colonizing entire star systems, and the colonies they were establishing were not just military outposts. They were self-sustaining, highly advanced hubs of research, industry, and civilian life. Each colony appeared to be a microcosm of Terran society, a reflection of their most successful cities and innovations. What was even more disturbing was the fact that these colonies weren't just populated by Terrans, they were populated by anyone. Alien species from across the galaxy, many of whom had long-standing alliances with the Senate, were migrating to the Terran colonies. Entire fleets of civilian ships had begun to leave their old homes and make the journey toward these new Terran outposts. Many species, it seemed, had already made the choice to abandon the old systems and start fresh within this new and mysterious Terran order. In secret meetings behind closed doors, the Senate's most powerful leaders began to realize something they had been trying to avoid. The Terrans weren't invading. They were creating something altogether different, a gravitational pull of their own, one that was drawing every species into their orbit. It was a quiet revolution, one that no fleet could challenge, no military force could defeat. The Terrans weren't looking to conquer the galaxy with warships and weapons. They were doing it with an irresistible vision of the future, one that appealed to the very thing every species wanted: prosperity, stability, and a future free from war. However, it wasn't just their technological marvels or their vision that captivated the galaxy. It was the Terran way of life. The colonies they built weren't just clean, efficient, and prosperous. They were comfortable. They were built for living, for thriving, and for evolving. Unlike the harsh, often militarized environments of other galactic outposts, the Terran colonies provided a new kind of promise: peace, opportunity, and the chance to rebuild what had been lost in the chaos of galactic wars. This new order, this new way of life, became known across the galaxy as the Event Horizon. It wasn't a political regime, nor a military initiative. It was a gravitational force of culture and influence, a quiet, irresistible pull that brought species and systems into its fold, one colony at a time. As the Senate met in yet another emergency session, the reality finally dawned. The Terrans had outplayed them all, not by force, but by the sheer power of their vision. The galaxy's powers had been blind to the quiet revolution unfolding right before their eyes. And now, it seemed, it was too late to stop it. The Terrans had already won. But unlike any victor in history, they had done it without firing a shot. They had built their empire not on conquest, but on something far more enduring, something no military power could ever hope to replicate: trust, peace, and the allure of a better future. And as the Senate's deliberations grew more frantic, one question lingered in the minds of the galaxy's leaders. How could they ever compete with that? The Senate was fractured. What had once been a unified body of diverse species now stood on the brink of disintegration. Each faction torn between those who saw the Terrans as an existential threat and those who believed that joining the Terran sphere might be the only way forward. The diplomatic corridors, once teeming with lively debate, now hummed with anxiety, suspicion, and a growing sense of helplessness. The so-called Event Horizon had drawn more and more systems into its gravitational pull as Terran colonies flourished across the galaxy. Entire planets, once at odds with each other, were now sending delegations to the Terran hubs, eager to share in the prosperity that the Terrans had seemingly perfected. Some species even went so far as to openly advocate for the dissolution of the Senate and the creation of a new interstellar governing body, one where the Terrans would hold sway. For the first time in centuries, the Senate was facing the prospect of being irrelevant, a governing body that was no longer necessary, no longer powerful. Species that had long relied on the political and military might of the Senate for protection were beginning to question whether the old order still held any value. The Terrans, after all, had shown them that there was another way. Ambassador Rorak, once a steadfast opponent of the Terran presence in galactic politics, now found himself reflecting on the strange allure of the Terran colonies. He had visited several of them during his diplomatic missions, and the contrast between these new worlds and the crumbling bureaucratic systems of the Senate was stark. The Terran colonies were vibrant, self-sufficient, and peaceful, their citizens working together to create something lasting, something tangible. They had abolished the old power structures that had kept species divided for millennia, and in their place, they had built communities based on cooperation, innovation, and mutual respect. It was a far cry from the Senate, where deals were made in backrooms, and the powerful dictated terms to the weak. But despite his growing admiration for the Terran way, Rorak couldn't bring himself to fully embrace the idea of surrendering the galaxy to them. Something about their dominance, the way they had reshaped entire systems without firing a single shot, felt like a silent imposition. They weren't just creating colonies, they were creating a new order, one that, for all its prosperity, also seemed to strip away the autonomy of the very species that had flocked to them. And yet, how could anyone argue against the results? The Terrans had created thriving colonies where species had once fought bitterly for resources. They had eliminated the crippling poverty and the wars that had plagued the galaxy for centuries. They were offering a future where every being, regardless of their origins, could thrive, but only within the framework they controlled. The Terran Empire, if such a thing could even be called an empire, wasn't an expansionist regime, but something much more dangerous. A slow, insidious integration. The Senate's military leaders were no better off than the diplomats. The once feared war fleets, once symbols of supreme power, were now seen as anachronisms. The Terrans had demonstrated that military might, no matter how vast, was irrelevant in a universe where economic, social, and technological influence reigned supreme. The Senate's fleets were now mere shadows of what they had once been, and there were no real options left for countering the Terrans' growing presence. In private, Admiral Hanar met with the leaders of the Federation's military council, his expression as grim as ever. He had always been a strategist, and even now, he was trying to find a way to combat the Terran juggernaut. But every plan he proposed seemed hollow in the face of their unyielding strategy. "They turned our own methods against us," he muttered to his colleagues. "Where we used military force, they used trust. Where we sowed division, they sowed unity. And now, the galaxy's people want nothing more than to join them." The Admiral's voice echoed in the cold, empty chamber. The realization had begun to settle in. The Senate couldn't fight the Terrans with weapons. They had to fight with something else. But what? The Senate's time of power was rapidly coming to an end, and as the galaxy hurtled toward an inevitable reckoning, one question burned in the minds of all its leaders. Would they continue to resist, or would they embrace the Terran order? And with it, the end of their own sovereignty. The edge of integration had arrived, and it was only a matter of time before the galaxy would find itself on. The Senate was on the verge of collapse. The weight of centuries of galactic dominance had grown too heavy for the old system to bear. As the Terrans continued to integrate more species and systems into their growing sphere of influence, the factions that once made up the Senate had fractured into camps of uncertainty and fear. Some argued for open surrender, hoping that by aligning with the Terrans, they might retain some semblance of autonomy. Others refused to bend the knee, seeing the Terrans as a threat to their very way of life, even as they were forced to acknowledge the inevitable. Ambassador Rorek, now back in his private chambers, sat alone in the dark, staring at the holographic map of the galaxy. He had spent decades working within the Senate, forging alliances, brokering peace treaties, trying to ensure that every species had a voice. But the voice of the Senate had grown quieter in recent months, drowned out by the quiet storm of Terran influence that spread like wildfire. He had spent weeks trying to come up with a solution, a diplomatic answer that could stave off the inevitable. But the truth was becoming undeniable. The Terrans weren't just a rising power, they were the power. And the Senate, for all its pomp and bureaucracy, was nothing more than an outdated relic of a past that no longer existed. Rorek had visited several Terran colonies in recent weeks. At first, he had been hesitant, viewing them as little more than sophisticated traps designed to pull species into the Terran fold. But what he had seen there had shaken him to the core. The colonies weren't just thriving, they were flourishing. Species that had once been at war now worked side by side in harmony. The Terrans had built an entire infrastructure of cooperation, where resources were shared and technology was advanced. The promise of peace, prosperity, and opportunity hung in the air like an intoxicating perfume. The Terrans had created something that was undeniably compelling and dangerously persuasive. The message that the Terrans had broadcasted to the galaxy in their earlier transmission now seemed all the more prescient. We are not interested in war. Not with you, not with anyone. But you must understand this. If we wanted to take everything you hold dear, we wouldn't need to lift a finger. We would only need to wait. It was a warning, yes, but more than that, it had been a promise. The Terrans had shown that they were patient, methodical, and far beyond any military or political challenge that could be thrown their way. They had waited for centuries, biding their time, and now they had succeeded without lifting a weapon. The Senate had two choices: adapt to the new order, or face utter irrelevance. Rorek's communication console flickered to life, and the face of Admiral Hanar appeared on the screen. The normally stoic Vrak commander looked weary, as if the weight of the galaxy itself had settled onto his shoulders. "We can't fight them," Hanar said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Not with force. Not with politics. They've already won. The galaxy's people are already moving toward them, without our help. The only question left is whether we fight the current or allow ourselves to flow with it." Rorek took a deep breath. The decision was upon him, and it wasn't just his to make. It was the decision of the Senate, of every faction, every species who had once been a part of this great galactic experiment. The Terrans were not conquerors. They were the architects of a new future, and whether the galaxy's leaders liked it or not, the future had arrived. The Senate called for one final session, a last-ditch effort to determine the fate of the galaxy. Ambassadors from every species filed into the chamber, but the room was thick with tension. There was no more room for debate. The time for action had come. Rorek stood before the assembly, his voice steady but heavy. "We face a choice," he began. "We can continue to fight the inevitable, or we can join a new era. The Terrans are not a threat. They are an opportunity. And if we are wise, we will recognize it before it is too late." The silence in the chamber was deafening. And then, slowly, as if one by one the weight of the decision began to sink in, the representatives began to nod, the murmurs of agreement spreading through the room. Rorek's heart pounded in his chest. The Senate was crumbling, but in its place, a new order would rise. The Terrans had shown them that the galaxy did not need more war, more bloodshed, or more division. It needed unity, and the Terrans had offered it. The decision was made. The Senate would formally dissolve, and a new council, a council of cooperation, would be established under the Terran framework. It wasn't submission. It was evolution. As the last vote was cast, Rorschach looked out across the room. The galaxy would never be the same. But perhaps, just perhaps, it was time for the galaxy to grow up.